Welcome to Political Tensions, where we dive deep into the most pressing issues shaping the future of America. Today, we bring you a fiery face-off between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President J.D. Vance. The topic: the controversial 2025 tariff policy, a policy that continues to divide politicians and shake global markets. The U.S.-China trade war has been a long-standing source of tension, but the paths proposed by Trump and Vance couldn't be more different. Trump stands firm on his America First platform, pushing for aggressive tariffs to curb China's influence and bring jobs back home. Vance, on the other hand, advocates for a more balanced and diplomatic approach, emphasizing long-term cooperation and economic stability. In the midst of growing economic uncertainty in 2025, with inflation concerns, supply chain disruptions, and global competitiveness at stake, this debate is more than political theater. It's a glimpse into two vastly different futures for America. Will the country double down on economic pressure, or seek a reset in global relations? Strap in, because this is more than a debate, it's a battle of ideologies. To understand the clash between Trump and Vance, we need to revisit the roots of the U.S.-China trade war. In 2018, under Trump's presidency, the U.S. imposed sweeping tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The move was framed as a bold strategy to correct what Trump called decades of unfair trade practices and to rebuild American manufacturing. Trump said, "They've been taking advantage of us for years. But now, America is fighting back. We're bringing jobs home, and we're doing it with strength." At the time, the policy divided economists and political analysts. Supporters argued it was a necessary shock to push back against China's dominance in global supply chains. Critics warned that the tariffs would backfire, leading to inflation, retaliatory measures from Beijing, and pressure on American farmers and consumers. Now in 2025, the debate is once again front and center. Trump, returning to the national spotlight with ambitions for re-election, has doubled down on his original strategy. He's calling for a second wave of tariffs, broader, harsher, and more permanent. Meanwhile, Vice President Vance, representing a younger, more globally minded conservative wing, argues that the time for confrontation has passed. He insists America needs to stabilize relationships, not strain them. Press conference footage of Vance speaking calmly to reporters. "Vance, we cannot afford to keep reacting with brute force. The world economy is interlinked. If we want American leadership, we need American strategy, not American isolation." It's a stark contrast, Trump's economic nationalism versus Vance's pragmatic globalism. Their visions extend far beyond tariffs, touching immigration, manufacturing, diplomatic relations, and even national identity. And with polling data showing the country nearly evenly split on the issue of tariffs, 47% in favor, 45% against, this isn't just a policy debate. It's a referendum on the soul of the Republican Party, and possibly the future of the nation itself. As the conversation moved forward, it quickly became evident that this would be no ordinary policy exchange. Trump, never one to shy away from confrontation, began to show signs of frustration with what he viewed as Vance's overly academic tone. To Trump, Vance's comments sounded detached, too theoretical for a problem he believed demanded raw, immediate action. The former president leaned forward, his voice growing louder as he criticized the vice president for sounding like a policy analyst rather than a man of action. He dismissed Vance's caution, asserting that what the country needed was boldness and strength, not intellectual debates. Audience reaction is split, some cheer Trump's assertiveness, others nod at Vance's composed demeanor. Vance, in contrast, remained calm and deliberate. He pointed out that the last round of tariffs under Trump had led to spikes in consumer prices and retaliatory actions that hurt American farmers. Rather than escalating the trade war, he argued, the U.S. should focus on smart diplomacy and long-term strategy. This difference in tone was striking. Trump projected urgency and force, framing the situation as a fight for American survival. Vance offered steadiness and analysis, positioning himself as the voice of reason in a volatile moment. The debate moderator made repeated attempts to bring the conversation back to order as Trump's interruptions grew more frequent. At one point, Trump forcefully declared that China only understands power, a sentiment met with cheers from his loyal supporters in the studio. Vance responded not with anger, but with a composed rebuttal, suggesting that true international respect comes not from intimidation, but from consistency and trust. This exchange did more than highlight a policy disagreement, it exposed a deeper generational and philosophical divide within the Republican Party. Trump was defending his legacy, invoking memories of his first presidency. Vance, meanwhile, was carving out an identity as the future of conservative leadership, measured, globally conscious, and policy-driven. The energy in the room was electric. On social media, clips from the debate began to circulate almost instantly. Supporters of each figure praised their champion, with hashtags like #TrumpStrong and #VanceVision trending nationwide. At the heart of the matter, however, was a shared belief: both men were convinced they were fighting for the future of America. And yet, their visions could not have been more different. As tensions simmered, Vance took the opportunity to shift the conversation toward facts and future outcomes. Drawing from economic data and recent studies, he laid out the long-term consequences of trade isolationism. Rather than inflaming the audience, he sought to ground them in numbers: rising prices, shrinking export opportunities, and fractured global supply chains that, according to him, were harming everyday Americans. Vance argued that the effects of high tariffs were already visible in American homes and businesses, from more expensive electronics to limited access to critical industrial components. He reminded the audience of the lessons learned from the previous round of tariffs, which not only failed to permanently shift trade balances but also ignited retaliatory policies that hit key American sectors like agriculture and auto manufacturing. While Trump had relied on a strong emotional appeal, Vance leaned on data. His charts showed that despite the rhetoric, the trade deficit with China had rebounded in recent years, suggesting that tariffs alone were not enough to fundamentally alter the economic relationship. Vance also emphasized the geopolitical risks of continued economic aggression. In his view, unilateral tariffs were alienating allies and pushing countries like China closer to rival powers. He proposed a new economic strategy, one rooted in multilateral cooperation and strategic investments in domestic innovation. He questioned whether America could truly remain competitive by cutting itself off from the global economy. Instead of punishing trading partners, Vance argued, the U.S. should outcompete them by becoming more resilient, technologically advanced, and diplomatically respected. Some in the audience seemed intrigued by Vance's vision. Others remained skeptical. But what was undeniable was the clarity and calm conviction with which he delivered his points. He wasn't trying to win by volume, but by presenting a broader, more sustainable roadmap for America's role in the world economy. In doing so, Vance painted himself as a forward-looking leader, one less interested in reliving past victories, and more focused on preparing the country for the global challenges of the next decade. As the dust settled from the debate stage, another front was opening for Donald Trump, this time, not with his political rival, but with the American media. Just hours after the debate aired, national headlines began circulating online, accusing Trump of stoking division, reviving failed strategies, and disregarding global economic realities. Major networks framed Trump's stance as reckless and outdated. Analysts pointed to the economic consequences of his previous trade war: higher consumer prices, fractured diplomatic relations, and volatility in global markets. They questioned whether his proposed tariff escalation would lead to a full-blown trade conflict at a time when global cooperation was more vital than ever. For Trump, these headlines were not unexpected. He had long accused mainstream media of bias, painting them as mouthpieces for globalist interests. At a hastily organized press conference held the following morning, the former president appeared visibly irritated, speaking over journalists, dismissing their concerns, and doubling down on his narrative. Trump accused the press of distorting his intentions, claiming that his policies were aimed at protecting American workers, not isolating the nation. He portrayed himself as a lone warrior fighting not just China, but a corrupted media landscape that refused to acknowledge what he framed as his economic triumphs. The more combative his stance, the more divided public opinion became. While his base remained unwavering, energized by his bluntness and unapologetic tone, critics saw a leader unable to adapt to an evolving world order. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like #StandWithTrump and #TrumpUnfiltered trended alongside #TariffTyrant and #BackToThePast. Commentators speculated that Trump's strategy was less about presenting economic nuance and more about reigniting a familiar narrative, him versus the establishment. By casting himself as the persecuted outsider, silenced by elites, opposed by media, Trump was once again speaking directly to his most loyal supporters, many of whom believed their struggles were being ignored by the mainstream. Yet, while his rhetorical style energized parts of the electorate, it also created significant hurdles with moderates, independents, and younger voters. Many of them found his aggressive posture unnerving in an already fragile global climate. For them, Trump's attacks on the media were not signs of strength, but of stubbornness, and perhaps fear. Ultimately, the media firestorm surrounding Trump's debate performance and his subsequent press conference overshadowed much of the policy content itself. While Vance's data-driven approach continued to circulate in academic circles and international outlets, it was Trump's fiery defense, and the media's aggressive response, that captured headlines. It became clear that for Trump, the media was not merely a vessel for critique. It was the perfect foil, a target that could rally his base and reframe the debate in populist terms. In his world, he wasn't just debating policy. He was fighting a system, and for millions of Americans, that made him more than a politician. It made him a symbol. While domestic arguments and media narratives dominated headlines, the true center of gravity in this debate remained half a world away, in Beijing. China, the economic superpower and perceived strategic rival to the United States, was the looming force that both Trump and Vance positioned themselves against, albeit in radically different ways. For Trump, China represented not just a competitor, but a threat, an adversary whose rise was synonymous with American decline. Throughout his presidency and in his current campaign narrative, he painted China as a master manipulator, responsible for job losses, intellectual property theft, and geopolitical instability. In Trump's worldview, any engagement with China that wasn't transactional and hardlined was naive, or worse, disloyal. His rhetoric was unapologetically hawkish. He promised to impose even steeper tariffs, investigate Chinese companies operating on U.S. soil, and limit academic and technological exchanges, framing these measures as patriotic imperatives. His base cheered them as signs of a leader unafraid to name and confront America's #1 rival. But Vance took a different approach. While he agreed that China posed serious long-term challenges, his strategy was not built around confrontation, but insulation. Instead of punishing China through tariffs, Vance spoke of bolstering domestic production through innovation, investment in high-tech sectors, and strengthening trade alliances to reduce reliance on Chinese supply chains. In interviews and debates, Vance reiterated that China had grown stronger not just through aggression, but by exploiting gaps in America's own economic infrastructure. He argued that isolationism wouldn't defeat China, only renewed American competitiveness could. To Vance, the true battleground was not customs offices or ports, but the labs, universities, and manufacturing floors of America's heartland. This strategic divergence was more than stylistic. It reflected contrasting beliefs about power, leadership, and the role of America in the 21st century. Trump's view of China was binary, a threat to be suppressed. Vance saw China as a complex force, dangerous, yes, but also a competitor that revealed the weaknesses America had neglected for decades. Meanwhile, from Beijing, there was silence, deliberate and unsettling. Chinese state media made only vague references to the debate, while government spokespeople declined to comment directly on Trump or Vance. But analysts noted increased diplomatic activity in Southeast Asia and a strengthening of economic partnerships with Russia and the EU, moves that some believed were preemptive defenses against a possible second Trump term. Back in the U.S., foreign policy think tanks issued warnings. Several reports projected that renewed hostilities under Trump could provoke retaliatory tariffs on American agriculture, further destabilize global supply chains, and harden alliances between America's competitors. Others argued that failing to push back decisively would allow China to dominate key sectors like AI, green tech, and global finance. For voters, the question was not whether China posed a threat, most agreed that it did. The question was how to respond. Trump offered confrontation, speed, and blunt pressure. Vance offered resilience, long-game strategy, and system-wide reform. It was a philosophical question as much as a policy one: should America defeat its adversaries through might, or surpass them through reinvention? As the debate deepened, one truth became increasingly clear: no matter which path the U.S. took, the question of China would define the next decade of American leadership. The stakes were global. The choices were stark. And the clock was already ticking. Beyond the soundbites, applause, and political posturing, the true weight of the Trump-Vance debate rested on one crucial factor: economic consequences. And no group was more vocal in this phase than the experts, a spectrum of economists, trade specialists, and policy advisors eager to dissect the long-term implications of the proposed strategies. Dr. Maya Holland, a trade policy analyst, warned that an aggressive re-implementation of Trump-era tariffs could spike inflation once again, especially in consumer electronics, auto parts, and agricultural supplies. Her models projected a 7% increase in average household expenditures if tariffs expanded to cover additional categories. However, not all voices in the economic arena were critical of Trump. Mark Denslow, a senior fellow at the American Nationalist Policy Forum, argued that temporary pain was necessary for long-term gain. He insisted that tariffs were not just an economic lever, but a moral stance, a way to signal that the U.S. would no longer tolerate exploitation by adversarial economies. The clash of data-driven forecasts and philosophical outlooks became a media spectacle of its own. Business networks ran competing models, one predicting recessionary drag under Trump's plan, the other showing gradual economic self-sufficiency if domestic manufacturing re-emerged at scale. Then came the perspective of global economists. Experts from the IMF and World Bank joined the discourse, warning that renewed tariff wars could further destabilize an already fragile post-COVID recovery. The World Bank issued a report estimating that a second wave of trade friction between the U.S. and China could reduce global trade by as much as $1.2 trillion over the next 5 years. Vice President Vance's proposals, in contrast, received mixed reviews. While many applauded his call for investment in U.S.-based innovation and tax incentives for reshoring, some critics argued his approach lacked immediate pressure mechanisms to counteract China's systemic market manipulation. Without punitive measures, skeptics feared, adversarial economies could continue flooding global markets with subsidized goods. Still, what made Vance's platform appealing to centrist economists was its flexibility. Unlike Trump's zero-sum framing, Vance acknowledged the need to work with allies. He proposed tariff harmonization with the EU, expanded digital trade pacts, and the creation of an Indo-Pacific Economic Resilience Council to coordinate fair trade enforcement. On cable networks and financial newsletters, a pattern began to emerge. Economists saw Trump's plan as bold but blunt, a sledgehammer. Vance's strategy was more surgical, more reliant on regulatory frameworks and investment, a scalpel. And while neither approach guaranteed success, both raised a fundamental question: how should economic power be wielded in a multipolar world? Even veteran voices who had advised both Democratic and Republican administrations weighed in. Former Treasury Secretary Elaine Goodman described the debate as a generational reckoning, adding that America was no longer the sole architect of the global economy, and its strategy must evolve accordingly. For the American people, these analyses provided more than just figures, they framed the stakes. It was no longer just about who sounded tougher or more optimistic. It was about which leader had a strategy that matched the moment, a rapidly shifting, increasingly interconnected, and relentlessly competitive global economy. In the weeks following the debate, voter polls began to reflect these insights. Support for Trump's approach grew among blue-collar regions still haunted by deindustrialization. Meanwhile, Vance gained traction with suburban professionals, tech workers, and young entrepreneurs eager for a smarter, less volatile path. Ultimately, the experts didn't decide the outcome, but they shaped the context. They made one thing clear: in this debate, tariffs were never just tariffs. They were proxies for values, visions, and the economic soul of a superpower at a crossroads. Beyond the national stage, the debate reignited smoldering tensions within the Republican Party. While Trump's performance invigorated the party's populist base, it also deepened the rift with establishment conservatives and younger policy reformers who saw Vance as a bridge to a new era. In the days that followed, party donors began drawing lines. Some repledged support for Trump, calling him the only candidate with the courage to confront America's rivals. Others shifted fundraising efforts toward Vance-aligned think tanks and PACs, eager to back a candidate who could appeal to moderates and independents in a changing electorate. The divide wasn't only strategic, it was generational. Senate Republicans under 50 voiced cautious optimism about Vance's global vision, while veteran lawmakers, many of whom rose through the Tea Party wave, reinforced Trump's calls for economic toughness. The result was a party struggling not just with messaging but with identity. Meanwhile, on the streets and across social media, Americans were making their voices heard. Rallies and town halls popped up nationwide, from Seattle to St. Louis, as citizens demanded a seat at the table in shaping trade policy. Farmers, truckers, tech workers, and student activists each brought their concerns forward. For some, Trump's call for American independence rang true, a cry for sovereignty in an unstable world. For others, it sounded like economic self-sabotage. Grassroots groups, many unaffiliated with either campaign, began publishing local impact reports and organizing bipartisan forums. One viral campaign, #Trade Truths, challenged influencers and politicians alike to explain their vision in 60 seconds, igniting a digital town square of trade literacy. Abroad, the world watched with bated breath. Allies worried about another round of U.S. unpredictability. Rivals saw opportunity. And global markets responded to every new poll and policy signal. Some governments began recalibrating their own policies. Canada accelerated trade talks with ASEAN. Germany floated the idea of a tariff shield against American import duties. Even South Korea opened a new bureau to monitor U.S. legislative changes in real time. At the United Nations, a resolution was quietly proposed to create a global trade mediation forum, a sign that the world was preparing for prolonged uncertainty. Whether America leaned into confrontation or cooperation, one thing was clear: its choices would shape more than its own destiny. As the lights dimmed on the debate stage and headlines began to fade, what remained was a nation grappling with a fundamental question: what should America's role be in the global economy of tomorrow? The clash between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance had brought two sharply divergent philosophies to the forefront. Trump, forceful and unapologetic, leaned into his legacy, a doctrine of economic combativeness and patriotic urgency. Vance, cool-headed and analytical, offered a recalibrated vision, one that sought strength not from defiance, but from modern reinvention. In the aftermath of the debate, policy circles began to speculate what each vision might look like in real terms. Under a revived Trump presidency, tariffs would likely be immediate and expansive, with the Department of Commerce tasked to identify hundreds of new categories for import taxation. Trade talks with China would be frozen, and domestic industries such as steel, oil, and auto manufacturing would see accelerated subsidies in hopes of stimulating a new industrial era. Conversely, a Vance-led strategy would prioritize new trade alliances, reshoring tax credits, and multilateral engagement. His administration would likely propose a global fair trade pact, uniting advanced economies around shared labor and environmental standards. Tariffs, if used, would be precision tools, applied surgically in response to documented violations. But the future of U.S. trade policy wouldn't be shaped by politicians alone. In the days after the debate, town halls, editorial boards, and social media feeds lit up with citizen response. Some applauded Trump's tough talk, calling for a return to economic nationalism and praising his clarity. Others praised Vance for his foresight and maturity, urging a departure from what they saw as years of erratic global engagement. Among younger voters, Vance's style appeared to resonate. A CNN youth poll showed that 61% of voters under 35 favored Vance's proposed global innovation strategy, citing trust in international cooperation and sustainable economics. Trump, however, held his ground among older voters, particularly in rural and post-industrial communities where trade disruption had once meant lost livelihoods. Foreign governments were watching, too. In Brussels, Tokyo, and Canberra, trade envoys began preparing briefing papers on possible U.S. policy shifts. Market forecasts fluctuated, and hedge funds adjusted commodity strategies based on which narrative, conflict or cooperation, seemed more likely to prevail. Amid the projections, one truth stood out: the United States was at a historic crossroads. Not only economically, but ideologically. This was not just a decision about tariffs. It was a decision about identity, power, and purpose. Should the U.S. continue trying to control the world's terms of trade? Or should it lead by collaboration, proving its influence through stability and shared prosperity? The answer would not come from one debate, nor even one election. But in this moment, with voices raised, visions drawn, and choices laid bare, the direction America takes next may define its legacy for generations to come.